The first thing you should know is that maps can lie. Not because they're drawn incorrectly. Not because someone forgot to update a trail after a storm or misplaced the contour line. Maps lie because they make us believe every place can be measured, labeled, and understood. They convince us that if a path exists, someone has walked it before us. If a campsite has a number, then someone planned it. Someone maintained it. Someone knew exactly where it was. I believed that for most of my life. Then I found campsite 20. Or maybe it found me. Even now, years later, when I unfold the official Yosemite visitor map they hand out at the entrance stations, I catch myself tracing the familiar loops and ridgelines with my finger, stopping at the orderly rows of numbered campsites. 19. 21. The numbering skips as if 20 never existed. Every version does. The park maps. The archived trail guides. The digital overlays. Even older editions buried in university collections. It's as though the number simply vanished from history, leaving behind a gap nobody notices unless they're looking for it. Most people never do. Sometimes I wish I hadn't. Because I can still remember the smell of the smoke. Not campfire smoke. Something older. Something that carried the scent of rain-soaked cedar, burned stone, and damp earth after lightning strikes a tree that has been standing for centuries. I remember hearing voices where no people should have been. I remember seeing tents that weren't there when the sun came up. Most of all, I remember leaving. At least I think I did. The strange thing about surviving certain places is that afterward you spend the rest of your life wondering whether some part of you ever truly came back. If you've ever spent time alone in the wilderness, you already understand that forests have personalities. Some invite you in. Some tolerate your presence. Others never stop reminding you that you're trespassing. The part of Yosemite where this happened felt different from the first moment I stepped beneath its trees. Not hostile. Not haunted. Just aware. I wasn't a park ranger, not a real one anyway. I worked as a seasonal wilderness researcher contracted through a university environmental monitoring program. My job was painfully ordinary compared to the stories people imagine when they hear backcountry. I cataloged tree health after wildfires, monitored water quality, documented erosion along lesser-used trails, and occasionally assisted with wildlife observation projects. Most of my days were spent carrying equipment that weighed far too much, writing notes nobody outside the research community would ever read, and appreciating the privilege of walking through some of the most breathtaking landscapes on Earth. Nature had always made sense to me. Not because it was predictable. Because it wasn't. Trees fall. Streams change course. Animals migrate. Storms erase trails. Nothing in the wilderness stays exactly the same, but everything changes according to rules that reveal themselves if you're patient enough to watch. I trusted those rules. I trusted my compass. My maps. My instincts. The wilderness rewards humility, but it also rewards observation. Or so I believed. My assignment that summer sounded almost relaxing. Several unusually strong winter storms had damaged portions of Yosemite's northeastern backcountry. Fallen trees blocked trails. Small landslides had shifted drainage patterns. A handful of old campsites needed inspection before maintenance crews could reopen them for the next season. Nothing unusual. Nothing dangerous. Certainly nothing mysterious. I was scheduled to spend 8 days alone documenting conditions across a network of remote camping areas that saw relatively little traffic compared to Yosemite Valley. The kind of assignment I preferred. Solitude has a rhythm. The first day, your mind races with unfinished conversations and forgotten errands. The second day, the noise starts fading. By the third, your thoughts begin matching the pace of your footsteps. You notice things. The different songs of chickadees. The way wind changes direction before afternoon storms. How granite stores the warmth of daylight long after sunset. You begin feeling less like a visitor and more like another living thing moving through the landscape. That's the version of solitude people write poems about. But there's another version. One that waits patiently until you've gone long enough without seeing another human face. It starts with tiny moments. You hear your own name in running water. You mistake twisted branches for standing figures. You become convinced someone is walking just beyond sight, matching your pace. Experienced backcountry workers talk about these things openly because pretending they don't happen only makes them worse. The human brain evolved in groups. Leave it alone long enough, and it starts creating company. Usually that's all it is. Usually. The trail began beneath towering sugar pines whose trunks disappeared into a ceiling of green hundreds of feet above me. Sunlight filtered through the branches in long golden shafts that shifted with every breeze. Ravens drifted silently overhead while the distant rush of the Merced River echoed somewhere beyond the granite ridges. It was beautiful. The kind of beauty that photographs never capture because photographs can't record silence. Real wilderness silence isn't empty. It's layered. Wind brushing needles. Insects hidden beneath bark. Water moving over stone. The distant crack of expanding granite under afternoon heat. Everything belongs. Everything has a place. Which is why I noticed the silence when it changed. Late on the second afternoon, I stopped to refill my bottles at a narrow creek that wasn't marked on my primary map but appeared exactly where my GPS indicated it should. The water was crystal clear. Cold enough to numb my fingers instantly. As I knelt beside it, every sound disappeared. No birds. No insects. No breeze. Even the creek seemed quieter. At first I thought I was imagining it. Then I realized I could hear my own heartbeat. Not metaphorically. Literally. Each beat echoed inside my ears with startling clarity. The forest wasn't silent. It was listening. The sensation lasted maybe 15 seconds. Then, all at once, the world returned. A raven called somewhere overhead. Branches swayed. The creek resumed its cheerful chatter against the rocks. I laughed at myself. Too much coffee. Not enough sleep. Isolation playing tricks already. I made a note anyway. Brief environmental silence. Possible weather shift. Scientists write down everything. Even the things they don't understand. Especially those. That evening I reached campsite 19. It matched the maintenance records perfectly. Fire ring intact. Bare locker functional. One damaged picnic table. Minor erosion near the northern edge. Routine. I cooked dinner while the last sunlight painted the granite cliffs deep orange. As darkness settled through the trees, stars emerged one by one until the sky became impossibly crowded with light. No city on Earth has a sky like the Sierra Nevada. Looking up there feels almost overwhelming, as though you're seeing more of the universe than your mind was designed to process. I remember thinking how lucky I was. How absurd it was that someone could get paid to experience places like this. Around midnight I woke for no obvious reason. The fire had long since burned to glowing coals. The air had turned cold enough that my breath fogged inside the tent. Something had changed. It took several seconds before I understood what. There was light outside. Not moonlight. Not a flashlight. A warm amber glow flickered gently through the fabric of my tent. Like another campfire. I checked my watch. 12:47 a.m. That didn't make sense. The nearest occupied campsite should have been several miles away. Fire regulations prohibited dispersed camping in this section. Still half asleep, I unzipped the tent and looked outside. Nothing. Only darkness. The glow had vanished. My own fire was nearly dead. No voices. No footsteps. No smell of smoke. Just trees. Towering black silhouettes standing motionless beneath a sky overflowing with stars. I walked a slow circle around camp with my headlamp. No fresh footprints. No signs of another campsite. No embers. Eventually I convinced myself I'd dreamed it. Sleep deprivation can blur the line between waking and dreaming in surprisingly convincing ways. I crawled back into the tent. Just before falling asleep, I heard something. A zipper. Not mine. Another one. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees. Followed by the unmistakable sound of someone quietly stepping onto pine needles. 1 foot. Then another. Then nothing. Morning erased the fear as efficiently as sunlight always does. Coffee helped too. By 8 o'clock I had packed camp and resumed my route toward the next inspection point. According to my printed map, there was only one campsite ahead. Number 21. The trail climbed steadily through granite outcrops and dense stands of red fir. Fallen logs forced occasional detours, while bright patches of wildflowers somehow survived between slabs of ancient stone. Everything felt reassuringly normal again. Until I found the sign. It stood beside the trail at an intersection that didn't exist on my map. Weathered wood. Fresh metal post. Official National Park typography. An arrow pointed left. Beneath it, burned into the wood with unmistakable precision, were two words. Campsite 20. For a long moment, I simply stared. Then I unfolded my map again. 19. 21. No 20. No side trail. No intersection. I checked my GPS. The device insisted I was standing exactly where the official trail should continue straight ahead. Yet the sign was real. The narrow path branching left was equally real, winding quietly between enormous pines as though generations of hikers had walked it. Someone had built that sign. Someone had maintained that trail. Someone had given a number to a place that, according to every official record I carried, had never existed. I should have turned around. Instead, with my notebook in one hand and curiosity outweighing common sense, I stepped onto the unmarked trail. The side trail was narrower than the main route, but not abandoned. That was the first detail that unsettled me. An abandoned trail disappears quickly in the Sierra. Snowmelt tears at the soil. Pine needles bury footprints. Young saplings lean across the path until the forest swallows every trace that humans were ever there. This trail had none of those signs. The earth was firm, packed by years of use. Low branches had been broken back just enough to keep the passage clear. Someone, whether recently or decades ago, had cared enough to maintain it. I looked back over my shoulder. The intersection was still visible between the trees. The official trail continued toward campsite 21 exactly where it should have. Nothing appeared unusual except for the weathered sign pointing me in another direction. I took out my GPS receiver again. The blinking cursor refused to acknowledge the trail beneath my boots. According to the screen, I was walking through untouched forest. I frowned. Consumer GPS units weren't perfect beneath dense tree cover. Granite walls could interfere with satellite reception. Multipath errors happened. Still, I'd never seen the trail itself disappear while I was standing on it. I marked a waypoint anyway. Unmapped spur trail. Professional habit. Document first. Question later. The forest changed almost immediately. Not dramatically. Gradually. So gradually that I couldn't identify the exact moment it happened. The air cooled by a few degrees. The breeze weakened. The scent of sun-warmed pine gave way to damp cedar and rich black soil. Even the light seemed different. Outside, sunlight had filtered through the canopy in bright golden beams. Here, it arrived as a muted silver glow, as though the sky itself had been covered with thin cloud. Yet when I glanced upward through the branches, the sky remained perfectly blue. I paused. Listened. Nothing. Not silence. Something stranger. The sounds felt farther away. Birds still called. Wind still moved. But every noise seemed to come from an impossible distance, like hearing the world through several closed doors. I shook my head. This place is getting inside your imagination. Saying it aloud helped. The human voice has a way of anchoring reality. At least, that's what I'd always believed. I continued walking. 10 minutes later, I came across the first campsite. Or what should have been one. The fire ring was intact. A steel bear locker stood beside it. A weathered picnic table leaned slightly to one side. Everything looked exactly like every other Yosemite campsite I'd ever inspected. Except, there wasn't a single trace that anyone had ever used it. No charcoal inside the fire ring. No scratches on the picnic table. No faded food wrappers caught beneath bushes. No boot prints. No old tent stakes forgotten in the soil. Nothing. It looked constructed, not lived in. As though someone had built an exact replica of a campsite without understanding why people camp there. I circled slowly, notebook in hand. The bare locker opened smoothly. Empty. No rust. No animal claw marks. No maintenance sticker. Even stranger, the inside smelled faintly of fresh cut wood. Steel doesn't smell like wood. I closed the door. The metallic clang echoed through the trees. Then echoed again. And again. Not reflections. Repeats. The same sound returning every few seconds from different directions, each one quieter than the last. I stood perfectly still. The echoes continued far longer than they should have. Eventually they faded. I wrote another note. Acoustic anomaly. Looking back now, I smile at those words. Acoustic anomaly. As if giving something a scientific label makes it less frightening. The trail continued deeper. The farther I walked, the older the forest appeared. Massive sugar pines twisted toward the sky like ancient pillars supporting an invisible cathedral. Their bark carried scars from fires older than my grandparents'. Granite boulders emerged from the earth like the backs of sleeping giants, covered in thick emerald moss that shouldn't have survived in that amount of sunlight. The forest felt untouched. Not pristine. Preserved. Like stepping into a photograph taken decades before. Around noon I stopped for lunch beside a fallen cedar. As I unpacked my food, I noticed another oddity. My watch had stopped. 11:18. Battery dead? Impossible. I'd replaced it the week before. I tapped the glass. Nothing. I pulled out my phone. No signal, naturally. The digital clock read 11:18. I restarted it. The screen flickered. Powered back on. 11:18. The seconds didn't move. A chill worked its way through my shoulders. Electronic failures weren't unheard of in remote areas. Cold weather drained batteries. Moisture caused glitches. But two separate devices stopping at exactly the same minute. That wasn't impossible. Just unlikely. Very unlikely. I laughed nervously. There has to be an explanation. The words sounded convincing. The forest didn't seem to agree. After lunch I packed my gear and continued. The trail began descending into a shallow valley where sunlight barely reached the ground. Tall ferns crowded both sides of the path. Moisture clung to every surface. The temperature dropped again. Then I noticed footprints. Finally. Evidence of another person. I knelt beside the nearest impression. Standard hiking boot. Men's, maybe size 10. Fresh enough that the edges remained sharp. Relief washed over me. Someone else had been here recently. Maybe a maintenance worker. Maybe another researcher. I followed the prints for nearly 50 yards before something occurred to me. Every footprint pointed in the same direction. Toward campsite 20. None led away. I searched carefully. Nothing. No return prints. No side path. No signs that whoever made them had ever walked back. The trail simply continued. The footprints simply ended. Not gradually. Abruptly. The last print pressed cleanly into the damp soil. One perfect impression. Then nothing beyond it. No disturbed leaves. No broken branches. No animal tracks crossing over. Just untouched earth. I stared at the final footprint for nearly a minute. Every instinct told me someone had stepped off the trail. Yet there was nowhere to step. Dense ferns surrounded both sides. Their delicate fronds stood completely undisturbed. If someone had pushed through them, they'd have left a tunnel. There wasn't one. I felt my breathing become shallow. The rational part of my brain began listing possibilities. Rain erosion. Animal interference. Faulty observation. Memory lapse. The frightened part offered only one thought. Turn around. I almost listened. Almost. Instead, I convinced myself I had come too far to leave without documenting whatever this place was. Curiosity has always disguised itself as courage. Sometimes they're the same thing. Sometimes they aren't. The valley opened into a broad clearing. At its center stood a wooden information board, exactly like the ones found throughout the national park. Trail etiquette. Wildlife reminders. Leave no trace principles. Except every notice had faded completely blank. Not weathered. Blank. As though ink had never touched the paper. Only one item remained readable. A campground map. I stepped closer. Rows of numbered campsites surrounded a central loop road. 1, 2, 3. All the way to 20. Every campsite was carefully labeled. Every trail drawn in meticulous detail. Everything appeared completely normal. Except the map depicted a campground I'd never seen. The surrounding mountains were wrong. The river curved in the opposite direction. Entire granite formations had shifted positions. The familiar geography of Yosemite had been rearranged by someone working from memory rather than reality. Still, one thing caught my attention immediately. A bright red dot near the bottom. You are here. It rested directly over campsite 20. Without thinking, I looked behind me. There was no campground. Only trees. When I looked back at the board, the red dot had moved. Not far. Just enough to make my stomach tighten. It now rested halfway between campsite 20 and the campground entrance. As though I had taken a step backward. I hadn't. I was certain of that. I blinked hard. The dot remained where it was. I leaned closer. The paper was dry. Old. Yellowed with age. There were no moving parts. No digital display. Nothing that could possibly explain what I'd just seen. A breeze stirred behind me. The first real wind I'd felt since entering the trail. It carried the unmistakable smell of campfire smoke. Fresh smoke. Someone was burning wood nearby. Then came laughter. Soft. Friendly. The easy laughter of people relaxing after a long day's hike. It drifted through the trees from somewhere ahead. I couldn't make out the words. Only the rhythm of several conversations overlapping around what sounded like a fire. Relief flooded through me. Other campers. Finally, I called out. Hello? The laughter stopped instantly. Not faded. Stopped. Every voice cut off in the exact same heartbeat. The silence that followed was so complete it felt physical. I waited. No reply. No footsteps. No rustling tents. Nothing. Then, from somewhere deep within the trees, a single voice answered. Quiet. Calm. Close enough that it should have been standing only a few yards away. You weren't supposed to find the sign. The words weren't shouted. They weren't whispered. They were spoken in the ordinary tone someone might use to comment on the weather. I spun toward the sound. No one. Only towering pines. Dark shadows between their trunks. The forest had become perfectly still once again. And for the first time since stepping onto the trail, I realized something that should have been obvious hours earlier. I couldn't remember which direction led back to the main path. I stood absolutely still, every instinct telling me to move while my body refused to obey. People imagine fear as panic. Racing hearts. Screaming. Running. Real fear is quieter than that. Real fear is the moment your brain begins rejecting the evidence your eyes are presenting because accepting it would require admitting the world no longer operates by the rules you've trusted your entire life. I turned in a slow circle. The clearing looked exactly as I remembered it. The weathered information board stood a few yards away. The narrow trail entered from one side and disappeared into the trees on the other. Simple. Obvious. Except I couldn't remember which side I'd come from. Both paths looked identical. The same crushed granite. The same ferns. The same enormous pines leaning inward as though they were trying to hide the trail from the sky. I searched for my own boot prints. Nothing. The ground that had preserved another hiker's footprints so perfectly now held no trace of mine. I crouched lower, brushing away pine needles with my glove. Fresh soil. No impressions. No drag marks from my backpack. No signs that anyone had walked there in weeks. A cold weight settled in my chest. I knew I hadn't imagined coming this far. My notebook was filled with observations. My GPS held waypoints. My water bottle was half empty because I'd stopped for lunch beside a fallen cedar. Those things had happened. Yet the forest had erased every physical sign that I had ever been there. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Panic narrows your thinking. It convinces you that every decision must be made immediately. Survival demands the opposite. I unclipped the orange survey ribbon from my pack, bright fluorescent tape we used to mark temporary research locations, and tied a strip around the nearest pine. If I became disoriented, I could simply follow the markers back. Simple. Reliable. Human. I chose the trail on my left. Not because I remembered it. Because the afternoon sun should have been somewhere to my right based on the route I'd taken that morning. At least, I thought it should. The forest swallowed me within a few dozen steps. I counted them automatically. 20. 40. 60. At 100 I stopped and looked back. The orange ribbon was gone. Not hidden. Gone. The pine tree itself remained. The bark looked untouched. I hurried back. The exact tree where I'd tied the ribbon stood in front of me. The knot had disappeared as though I'd never tied it. I checked my backpack. The roll of ribbon was still clipped to my shoulder strap. Only one strip was missing. I stared at the loose end hanging from the roll. Had I forgotten to tie it? Dropped it? No. I could still remember pulling the knot tight with both hands. Memory insisted one thing had happened. Reality insisted another. Neither felt willing to compromise. I tied a second ribbon. This time I photographed it with my phone. The image appeared on the screen exactly as expected. Bright orange against dark bark. Satisfied, I continued another 50 yards before turning around. The ribbon was gone again. Hands shaking now, I opened the photograph. The image had changed. The pine remained. The bark remained. But there was no ribbon. The photos showed only an empty trunk. No sign it had ever existed. For a long time, I simply stared at the screen. Then I laughed. A short, sharp sound that barely sounded human. Not because anything was funny. Because laughter was the only response my mind could find when logic collapsed beneath it. I shut off the phone and shoved it into my pocket. No more photographs. No more electronics. I trusted my senses more than machines. At least, I still did then. The trail climbed steadily until the trees began thinning around enormous slabs of polished granite. The rock reflected sunlight with an almost metallic brightness, forcing me to shield my eyes. Ahead, the forest opened. I expected another clearing. Instead, I found a campground. Not a campsite. An entire campground. Rows of vacant campsites circled a wide central road. Wooden posts marked parking spaces. Bare lockers stood beside immaculate picnic tables. Stone fire rings waited for fires that had never been built. Everything appeared perfectly maintained. Perfectly clean. Perfectly unused. No tire tracks. No footprints. No scraps of firewood. No ashes. No food smells. No bird droppings on the tables. Even the leaves seemed reluctant to fall inside the campground, collecting neatly around its edges as though an invisible line kept nature from crossing. I counted. 1, 2, 3. The numbered markers continued around the loop. 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Then, 20. The post stood alone beneath an enormous Jeffrey pine whose branches stretched over the site like protective arms. The number had been carved into polished cedar. Simple black paint. Nothing unusual. Yet my eyes kept returning to it. 20. The number missing from every official map. The place that wasn't supposed to exist. I remained at the edge of the campground for nearly 5 minutes. No movement. No sound except a distant breeze. No people. Eventually curiosity won. Again. The campsite itself looked almost inviting. A level tent pad. Freshly split logs stacked beside the fire ring. A wooden bench facing the trees. Someone had even left a small enamel coffee pot resting near the stones. I approached cautiously. The coffee pot was warm. Not hot. Warm. As though someone had lifted it from a fire only minutes earlier. I jerked my hand back. "Hello?" My voice carried across the empty campground. No answer. But something answered in another way. A tent flap rustled. Not in my campsite. Across the loop. Then another. Canvas shifting gently. One after another. Dozens of empty tents, tents that hadn't been there a second earlier, now stood quietly beneath the trees. Blue. Green. Orange. Old canvas models. Modern backpacking tents. Large family shelters. Small bivy sacks. They occupied nearly every campsite. My pulse hammered. Had they always been there? No. Impossible. The campground had been empty. I was certain. I backed away slowly. Every tent remained closed. Every zipper sealed. No smoke rose from the fire rings. No voices drifted between the trees. Just rows of silent shelters. Occupied by something. Or perhaps nothing at all. A movement caught the corner of my eye. Someone stood near campsite 11. A man. Middle-aged. Gray backpack. Red flannel shirt. He faced away from me, looking into the forest. Relief crashed over me. Another hiker. Finally. I raised a hand. "Excuse me." The man didn't move. I walked closer. "Hey!" Still nothing. Maybe he was wearing headphones. I closed the distance until only 30 feet separated us. That's when I realized something impossible. He hadn't moved because he wasn't breathing. His shoulders never rose. Never fell. He stood perfectly still. Like a mannequin. A breeze stirred the branches overhead. His jacket fluttered. His hair moved. But the rest of him remained frozen. I took another cautious step. A twig snapped beneath my boot. The sound echoed across the campground. Instantly. Every tent zipper opened. Not gradually. All at once. A chorus of metallic whispers swept around the loop. Zizzip. 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 Dozens of tents. Dozens of openings. Every flap slowly folded outward. Every interior remained dark. Far darker than the afternoon sunlight should have allowed. The man in the red flannel tilted his head. Only his head. Not his shoulders. Not his body. His neck turned farther than any human neck should. 45 degrees. 90. 120. Until the back of his head faced me. Then it kept turning. His face came into view upside down over his own shoulder. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't monstrous. It looked heartbroken. Like someone recognizing a friend they had hoped would never return. His lips moved. I couldn't hear the words. Yet somehow I understood them. "You're early." The realization struck me with nauseating force. He wasn't talking about today. He wasn't talking about this campground. He was talking about me. As though he already knew me. As though this meeting had happened before. A sharp pain exploded behind my eyes. Images flooded my mind. Fragments. Standing beside the same fire ring at night. Laughing with strangers whose faces blurred whenever I tried to focus. Writing notes in my notebook. Crossing out my own handwriting. Walking away from campsite 20. Returning again. Leaving. Returning. Again. 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 The memories vanished as suddenly as they had appeared. I stumbled backward, grabbing the nearest picnic table to steady myself. My notebook slipped from my hand and hit the ground. Its pages fanned open in the wind. I bent to retrieve it. And froze. The pages weren't blank. Someone had filled nearly half the notebook. In my handwriting. Not recent notes. Older entries. Dozens of them. Every page began with a date. None of the dates matched the current year. The earliest entry was nearly 15 years old. The latest was tomorrow's date. I stared at the notebook until the words stopped looking like handwriting and started looking like cracks spreading through glass. For several long seconds, I convinced myself there had to be a rational explanation. Wrong notebook. Stress. An old field journal I had accidentally packed. My fingers clung desperately to those possibilities because the alternative was unbearable. Slowly, I flipped back to the first unfamiliar page. The paper had yellowed slightly around the edges, as if it had aged naturally over many years. The ink, however, was unmistakably mine. Same pressure. Same habit of crossing my sevens. Same tendency to leave too much space between paragraphs. Even the small coffee stain in the lower corner matched one I'd made months earlier while organizing equipment at the university lab. I had written these pages. I simply had no memory of writing them. The first entry began without explanation. I found the campground again today. Again. The word tightened something deep inside my chest. I kept reading. The signs are always different. Sometimes the trail begins near the river. Sometimes beyond the burned scar. Once it appeared behind a ranger station that had already been demolished. It never matters. If it wants you to arrive, you arrive. A cold breeze drifted across the campground. The pages fluttered beneath my trembling fingers. Another sentence caught my eye. Do not trust the sky after sunset. I looked up automatically. The afternoon sun still hung above the trees. Yet, it seemed lower than it should have been. Much lower. I checked my watch. 11:18. Still frozen. The shadows stretching across the campground suggested late evening. Impossible. Had I really spent that many hours wandering? No. Even if I had, the position of the sun was wrong. It had moved too quickly. Or perhaps, everything else had. The realization settled over me with suffocating certainty. Time wasn't behaving normally here. I turned another page. If you hear people calling your name, don't answer. Another. If you see your own campsite, keep walking. Another. If someone asks how many nights you've stayed, never count aloud. My breathing became shallow. The entries grew more frantic. Sentences scratched over one another. Entire paragraphs blacked out. Repeated warnings circled until the paper nearly tore. You only remember leaving. You never remember arriving. My pulse thundered inside my ears. Because that sentence felt true. I could remember beginning this assignment. Packing my truck. Checking my gear. Driving through the entrance gate. I remembered reaching campsite 19. But everything between there and this moment already felt strangely blurred. Not forgotten. Smoothed over. Like memories viewed through moving water. A voice interrupted my thoughts. You've started reading them. I spun around. The man in the red flannel no longer stood across the campground. Now he sat quietly on the bench beside campsite 20. His posture was relaxed. Hands folded together. Face gentle. He looked less frightening up close. In fact, he looked exhausted. Deep lines surrounded his eyes. Gray stubble covered his jaw. His clothes belonged to another decade. Heavy leather boots. An old aluminum frame backpack. Equipment no serious backpacker had carried in years. He watched me with the expression of someone waiting for bad news they'd already accepted. I asked you a question, I said. My own voice sounded thin. He smiled faintly. No. You spoke. I did. You said I was early? I usually do. My stomach tightened. What does that mean? Instead of answering, he looked toward the trees. The birds haven't come back yet. I followed his gaze. The forest remained empty. No movement. No songs. Nothing. When I looked back, the man had moved. Not gradually. Instantly. He now stood only 10 feet away. I hadn't seen him cross the distance. Every muscle in my body locked. He noticed. They always freeze here first. What? People. His voice remained calm. They stop trusting themselves before they stop trusting the forest. I took one careful step backward. So you're real? He considered the question. I think so. That wasn't the answer I wanted. I've been trying to leave, he continued quietly. For how long? He looked down at his hands. I used to know. Silence settled between us. Finally, he asked, What year is it? The question sounded absurd. Still, I answered. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, tears stood in the corners. I've missed more than I thought. I didn't know what to say. The researcher inside me wanted information. Facts. Names. Dates. The frightened animal inside me wanted only distance. What is this place? His smile disappeared. The wrong question. Then what's the right one? He looked directly into my eyes. Why does it keep making us remember? Before I could respond, something cracked in the distance. A tree. The sound echoed through the campground. Then another. Then another. One by one, enormous trees began falling somewhere beyond the forest. Not toward us. Away from us. Like a line of dominoes collapsing into the wilderness. The man listened carefully. His face lost all color. We're out of time. For what? They've noticed. Who? He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed my wrist. His hand felt ice cold. Run! Instinct overruled reason. We sprinted together between the campsites. The campground changed as we ran. The empty tents were no longer empty. Shapes moved behind the fabric. Slowly. Patiently. Silhouettes crossing in front of lantern light that didn't exist. I heard conversations. Families laughing. Children arguing. Cooking pots clattering. The comforting sounds of an ordinary campground settling in for the evening. Yet every campsite remained visibly deserted. The sounds belonged to people I couldn't see. The man pulled me toward the far edge of the campground. There! A narrow trail descended into dense forest. We plunged beneath the trees just as another sound rolled across the campground. Someone called my name. Not shouted. Spoken gently. Exactly the way my mother used to wake me for school. I nearly turned. The man tightened his grip painfully. Don't. That's my. I know. The voice came again. Closer. Warm. Familiar. Then another voice joined it. My younger sister. Dead for 12 years after a car accident. She laughed. Not a memory. Not imagination. Her laugh carried every tiny imperfection I remembered. The slight snort whenever she laughed too hard. The catch in her breathing afterward. I stopped running. Tears blurred my vision. It can't be. The man shoved me forward. It isn't. But I heard. It heard you first. The trail twisted sharply downhill. Branches clawed at our jackets. Loose granite slid beneath our boots. Behind us, more voices joined the first. Friends. Old professors. My father. Co-workers. Every person I'd ever lost. Every relationship left unfinished. Every goodbye I wished I could say one more time. Each voice spoke with perfect familiarity. None sounded threatening. None begged. They simply invited. As though waiting around a campfire just beyond the trees. The greatest temptation wasn't curiosity. It was hope. Hope that grief had somehow been mistaken. Hope that impossible things could still become real. The man beside me never looked back. They're not copying them, he said between breaths. They're copying you. What? They don't know your family. He jumped over a fallen log. They know your memories. His words struck harder than fear itself. The forest wasn't showing ghosts. It was showing me. Using everything I loved as bait. The trail ended abruptly at a granite overlook. Beyond it stretched Yosemite. Or something that resembled Yosemite. The mountains were wrong. Half-domes stood where no mountain should. Entire valleys folded into impossible angles. Rivers climbed uphill. The horizon curved inward instead of away. It looked less like a landscape, and more like someone's imperfect memory of one. The man whispered, "Don't look too long." Too late. The longer I stared, the more familiar the impossible landscape became. Not because I'd seen it before. Because my mind began correcting it automatically. Straightening rivers. Moving mountains. Repairing reality. Except, reality wasn't changing. My perception was. The forest wasn't breaking the world. It was persuading the human mind to rebuild it until the impossible felt normal. Until contradictions no longer mattered. Until memory itself became more convincing than truth. I stumbled backward. The man caught my arm. "You finally see it. What is this place?" He looked toward the impossible horizon. "I don't think it's hiding from us." His voice had become almost a whisper. "I think..." He swallowed hard. "It's where forgotten places go after people stop believing they ever existed." Before I could ask another question, the ground beneath our feet trembled. Deep within the forest behind us, dozens of campfire flames ignited simultaneously. 1. Then 10. Then 50. Hundreds of warm orange lights flickered to life among the trees. And from every fire, someone slowly stood up. The first figures rose so slowly that, for a heartbeat, I mistook them for smoke. Orange firelight stretched long shadows across the forest floor as silhouettes unfolded from camp stools, sleeping bags, fallen logs, and places where, only moments before, there had been nothing at all. One. Then another. Then dozens. Then hundreds. No one spoke. No one rushed toward us. They simply stood around their campfires, facing the overlook. Facing us. The man beside me lowered his eyes. "Don't count them." I frowned. "What?" "Whatever you do." His voice shook for the first time. "Don't try to count." Of all the warnings in that impossible place, it was the strangest. Naturally, I ignored it. The human mind searches for patterns even when it shouldn't. Rows of campfires stretched across the valley like constellations scattered among the trees. 10. 20. 50. 100. The farther I counted, the farther the lights seemed to spread. Every time I believed I'd reached the edge of them, another cluster appeared beyond the last. The valley became a sea of impossible orange flames. Thousands. No. More than thousands. There weren't enough people in Yosemite to fill that many campsites. There never had been. The number refused to settle. It kept growing. Not because new fires were appearing. Because my brain had stopped understanding what it was seeing. A sharp pain exploded behind my eyes. I squeezed them shut. When I opened them again, the valley was empty. No campfires. No people. Only darkness beneath the trees. I exhaled in relief. Then noticed the smell. Wood smoke. Fresh. Close enough that it should have been drifting across my face. The valley looked empty. My senses insisted it wasn't. The man whispered, "Now they know you can see them." Before I could answer, a voice echoed from somewhere below. "Camp check." Another voice answered from farther away. "Site occupied." Then another. "Site occupied." The calls spread through the forest in every direction. Measured. Calm. Professional. Exactly like backcountry staff checking campsites before nightfall. Except, there were far too many voices. Each one sounded slightly different. Different ages. Different accents. Men. Women. Old. Young. The same phrase repeated over and over. "Site occupied. Site occupied. Site occupied." The sound rolled through the wilderness until it became impossible to tell where one voice ended and another began. The man stepped backward from the overlook. "They're counting." "Counting what?" He looked at me with quiet pity. "Us." A branch snapped behind us. Then another. Someone was climbing the trail. Slowly. Deliberately. Heavy boots scraping granite. Not one person. Several. The footsteps remained perfectly synchronized. Crunch. 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 The rhythm reminded me of organized search teams. Experienced. Disciplined. Close. A beam of light swept through the trees. Flashlights. Relief surged through me. Finally. Real people. I hurried toward the trail. The man grabbed my sleeve. No! They're rescuing us! They're not! The flashlight beams grew brighter. I could hear voices now. Clear voices. Environmental survey team. Another called. We received your emergency beacon. I froze. Emergency beacon? I hadn't activated mine. A third voice. We've been looking everywhere. Everything about them sounded right. Calm. Professional. Exactly how trained rescuers should sound. The lights crested the ridge. 3 figures emerged between the trees. They wore modern park uniforms. Reflective patches. Medical packs. Satellite radios. One even carried the same GPS model clipped to his vest that I had issued from the university. The lead rescuer smiled. There you are. I nearly cried with relief. He held out a hand. You've been missing. I looked back toward the man in the red flannel. He had gone pale. They've never looked this real before. The rescuer followed my gaze. Who's he talking to? I turned back. The red flannel man had disappeared. Completely. Only empty granite remained. The rescue worker frowned with concern. Sir? My pulse raced. Had I imagined him? No. He'd grabbed my arm. We'd spoken. The rescuer stepped closer. You're dehydrated. He offered me a bottle of water. I reached for it. Something caught my eye. His name tag. The letters had been scratched away. Only a single number remained stamped into the metal beneath it. A chill raced through my body. The other 2 rescuers wore identical tags. The lead rescuer noticed me staring. His smile widened. Not unnaturally. Just too patiently. We've been waiting. Those words. The same feeling. The same certainty I'd experienced when the man in red said, You're early. Only now the sentence had changed. Not early. Waiting. As though time itself meant nothing here. Behind the rescuers, more flashlight beams appeared among the trees. 5. 10. 20. Entire search teams climbing silently toward us. Each uniform identical. Each face friendly. Each name tag blank except for one carved number. I backed away. The lead rescuer kept smiling. You've been here longer than you think. No. You always say that. Always. The words struck like a physical blow. Memories flooded back. Not visions. Memories. Standing on this same overlook. Different clothes. Different backpack. Different weather. Listening to the same voice. Refusing the same hand. Another memory. Accepting the water bottle. Walking into the trees with the search team. Another. Running alone. Another. Meeting the man in red. Another. Being the man in red. I staggered. The world tilted. The rescuer's face blurred. For one impossible instant, I saw another face beneath his. Mine. Older. Tired. Watching me with unbearable sadness. You don't rescue people here, I whispered. His smile faded. No. The honesty in that single word frightened me more than every impossible thing I'd witnessed. What do you do? He answered quietly. We replace them. The forest erupted. Every campfire in the valley flared at once. A wind unlike any natural wind tore through the trees, carrying thousands of overlapping voices. Some cried. Some laughed. Some prayed. Some simply whispered names. All of them belonged to people searching for someone they had lost. The rescuer stepped forward. You don't have to remember anymore. His hand remained extended. So tired. The words slipped from my own mouth before I realized I'd spoken them. Because I was exhausted, confused, grieving things I couldn't name. There was a terrible comfort in the thought of surrendering, of letting someone else carry the weight, of forgetting. I reached toward his hand. Then, a single sound cut through the voices. A raven. One harsh call from somewhere high above the trees. Everything stopped. The wind. The whispers. The flames. For the first time since entering Campsite 20, I heard an ordinary sound from the real forest. One living bird. The spell broke. I remembered something my grandmother used to say whenever we'd hike together as a child. The woods aren't trying to trick you. Only lonely people do that. That simple memory saved my life. Because I suddenly understood. Nothing in this place had attacked me. Nothing had chased me. Nothing had forced me to stay. It had only offered what I wanted most. Answers. Closure. The chance to undo regret. The chance to speak one more time with people whose voices existed only inside my own heart. The horror had never been a creature hiding in the trees. The horror was discovering how willingly the human mind walks into its own prison when hope wears the face of memory. I stepped backward. Then another. The rescuers watched without moving. Their smiles slowly disappeared. The lead figure nodded once. Almost respectfully. I hope, he said softly, you remember this time. The world shattered. Not exploded. Shattered. Like thin ice breaking beneath my feet. The campground. The valley. The mountains. The impossible sky. Everything fractured into countless pieces of light. Then darkness. I woke face down beside a shallow creek. Cold water flowed around one arm. Morning sunlight filtered through towering sugar pines. Birds sang from every direction. My head pounded. For several minutes, I couldn't remember where I was. Then I saw the official trail. Only 20 yards away. Exactly where it should have been. No side path. No weathered sign. No hidden campground. Only the marked route toward Campsite 21. Search teams found me later that afternoon after I failed to report in on schedule. They blamed dehydration. Stress. A mild concussion from an apparent fall. Every explanation sounded reasonable. None explained my notebook. Nearly half its pages had been filled. Not with observations. With one sentence. Repeated hundreds of times in my own handwriting. Don't look for Campsite 20. It only exists once you believe it's missing. Years passed. Life slowly returned to normal. I left field research. Eventually I stopped telling anyone about what happened because every retelling made the memories feel less believable. Until one winter afternoon, curiosity overcame caution. I visited an archive containing decades of Yosemite planning records. Old maintenance logs. Historic campground surveys. Hand-drawn engineering maps. Thousands of pages documenting every trail and campsite the park had ever maintained. I wasn't looking for proof anymore. I only wanted certainty. Something to convince myself that trauma had distorted an ordinary experience. After hours of searching, I found a maintenance ledger from the early 20th century. Its pages were brittle enough to crumble if handled carelessly. Most entries listed routine repairs. Bridges. Fire rings. Trail markers. Then, near the bottom of one page, a single line had been crossed out so heavily that someone had nearly torn through the paper. Holding the page beneath the archive light, I could just make out the original words beneath the ink. Campsite 20, permanently removed from public. The rest had been destroyed. I never went back. I never searched again. Sometimes, though, when I unfold a modern Yosemite map, my eyes still drift unconsciously from 19 to 21. For the smallest fraction of a second, I always expect to see another number waiting between them. And every once in a while, when the room is quiet enough and the world has settled into that strange stillness that comes just before sleep, I think about the people who never escape the places their own minds built for them. We spend our lives believing the darkest corners of the wilderness hide monsters waiting to be discovered. But forests have always been honest. They reflect what enters them. The greatest horror is not always what waits beyond the trees. Sometimes the greatest horror is realizing there are parts of ourselves so desperate for certainty, forgiveness, or one more goodbye that, if the darkness ever offered them, we would step willingly off the map, and never notice we had stopped trying to find the way home.